guys, and welcome to today's instructional video. Today we're going to learn about a super important event in American history called Brown versus Board of Education. Now, this is a Supreme Court case that had a major impact on the way that American society functions, our school system, as well as on the realistic fiction and the short stories that came out of this time. Now, the short story that you're about to read, First Day of School, is actually a reflection of this time period and some of the challenges that the people during the 1940s and 1950s were facing. Now, before we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, it's really important to get some context for what that time period was like in terms of like the laws and in terms of the feelings that people had. One of the most important feelings to understand and recognize as being prevalent in society is racism. Now, racism, of course, is this belief that one race or that a set of races is better than and superior to other races. Of course, that's never true, but the United States has a very long history with racism, especially towards African Americans. Now, this begins before the Civil War when we were carting in people of color to use as property and as slaves. Now, of course, people of color are unjustly treated as property here, rather than as individuals with dreams and thoughts and souls and hopes and feelings, and they're often treated like animals, like pets, like something that is less than human, that is subhuman. So now that you have a basic understanding of what racism is and sort of when it came about, it's important that you also recognize that after the Civil War, it wasn't like racism just disappeared overnight with slavery. In fact, despite the fact that there were some progress markers for people of color, like the right to vote being established, like this idea that they are finally going to be treated as human beings, these concessions in the law don't mean that these ideas permeate society at this point. Meaning that if you just like run up to someone in the street and you ask them how they feel about people of color being human, a lot of times during this time period, they're not going to agree. Now, in 1896, there's a Supreme Court case that comes around before Brown versus Board of Education. And basically, this Supreme Court case says, hey, look, as long as you're giving them the same quality stuff, it's okay if like African Americans and people of color don't use the same stuff as you. As long as they have their own section on a bus, you don't have to share the white section with people of color. You can have your own water fountain just for whites, as long as there is also a water fountain for people of color. And this idea is called separate but equal. Now, this means, of course, that schools, water fountains, buildings, restrooms, buses are all separated based off of the color of your skin. And when we're talking about that separation, we're calling it segregation. Now, I do have a brief video from the time period that I would actually like to show you about this small town that believes that they've kind of got it all figured out. They have people of color and white people like living in harmony, and they say that the people of color actually really like how they're doing things, despite the fact that they're a segregated society. But I want you to watch, and I want you to listen and tell me if you think that this society is actually so perfect after all, based off of what they say.
Oxford is, in my opinion, is one of the finest little communities to raise a family. We've been used to more or less a segregated life. This is something that our colored people here are adjusted to. They are happy and they're well satisfied. A lot of them depend largely upon the white. And I would like to say this, that the white people here depend largely on them for help and so on. And they will go to their aid. That's what the colored people like. They like someone that if they get in trouble, or sickness, or that church should burn or something, the white people here step in and they help them out, and the colored people appreciate it.
That no amalgamation of races should be allowed. In other words, they did not permit intermarriage. It was made death to maim or kill a horse, or a cow, or a slave.
By 1885, separate schools were the new order. At white and Negro schools, children, using the same textbook, learned the traditions of the past and absorbed the values of the present. In their History of Mississippi textbook, they read of life on a Mississippi plantation. The master and the mistress taught the Negroes truthfulness and honesty, as they taught their own children, by not tempting them and by trusting them. With Negro slaves, it seemed impossible for one of them to do a thing without the assistance of one or two others. Of course, some kind of occupation had to be devised to keep them employed a part of the time, but it was very laborious to find easy work for a large body of lazy and inefficient people.
I think the thing that Reconstruction did was not as important as the fact that the slave was now free, and a place had to be found for him. And the number, the sheer number, you see, of these untrained people, well, it was a tremendous problem. Well, I guess it's just plain born in us, instilled in us. In spite of the fact that you have great respect for some Negro individuals, respect them as people, and not just as a servant. There is some physical revulsion, I think, that the skin is dark.
So, of course, the things they're saying seem really problematic, right? They're saying that people of color are like inherently lazy and need to be told what to do because they can't just find their own jobs. That white people need to invent a place for them in society as if they're too like babyish to find their own role. And of course, this is all, again, wrong. But one important thing to remember is that this idea of separate versus equal that Plessy versus Ferguson allows for isn't equal, especially in schools. African American students in their schools, despite the fact that they're supposed to have the same resources and the same quality education, often get fewer resources. They get crappier rooms, they get crappier books. They don't get as many books at all. And they often receive an inferior education to white students. Not to mention the fact that if I tell you you don't get to go to this school that's super beautiful and super nice just because of the color of your skin, you might start thinking you're inferior anyway. And we have images to show this too. If you take a look at what a white classroom looks like versus an African American classroom in that time period, you can see that it's not equal and it's definitely separate, but no one would want to learn in the second room. Plessy versus Ferguson stays intact for about 50 years, during which time Southern states make further laws that actually require segregation. Not only is it okay, but you have to do it. And all of these concessions that have been made to help treat people of color like humans are being violated in the South. Instead of people being able to vote, though they legally can, you have to pay this tax that is really prohibitive for a lot of people. So then you end up not being able to vote. So in 1954, all of this sort of comes to a head when the Supreme Court hears a case called Brown versus Board of Education. And for the first time, the Supreme Court does like the right thing by people of color and decides unanimously that separate does not mean equal, and in fact, it is always unequal. And the court even says at one point, quote, "To separate African American children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone." Now, the lawyer who's in charge of the Brown versus Board of Education arguments also sort of states that, like, the whole reason that people want to keep separate but equal is because they want to keep people of color and African Americans as close to being slaves as possible. Now, also because the court recognizes that a lot of racists are going to be really unhappy with this decision, they wait an entire year before they issue an order trying to enforce Brown versus Board of Education. So before they force states to also allow Black students to come and integrate into white schools, meaning they kind of get to mix in. And during this time, these students, these children who are just trying to get an education are facing an insane amount of hate and danger. There are people lining up in the streets, crowding the paths to school, throwing things at them, hurling obscenities, profanity, and horrible words towards these children who are just trying to get to school. Now, even though the Supreme Court did the right thing in their decision on Brown versus Board of Education, this didn't transform the country overnight, and racism did not just fall because segregation did. But the positive in this is that striking down segregation provided this catalyst, this change for the civil rights movement. And it also implied that segregation outside of public schools, in bus stops, in bathrooms, in buildings, in restrooms, is also unfair and unequal and shouldn't be allowed. Not to mention, this decision gives millions of Americans hope that our society is headed in a better direction because finally humans are being treated like the humans they are. So this is the world that the short story you're about to read comes from. This is the world that, like, the United States that you live in today came from. It's an important part of our history that we need to acknowledge so that we know where we come from as we move on the path towards progress. And this short story has an important place in our society today because it helps remind us that the first day of school that a lot of us take for granted today was a matter of great import in the past.